and knowing what our roles are in this whole system.
I'm always reminded quickly of a story. When I was overseeing Homeland Security in the Chicago urban area, I got a call from a school. They were asking for help from us about dealing with school safety and security. And I said, well, have you spoken to your local police chief or your local police department? They hadn't called him. The police chief happened to be Jewish, which that's, there are some of us. But they had never had a communication. He'd been the chief for 7 years. He had never been to the school. But as soon as they picked up the phone and called, he was there and his team was there. And so a lot of times it's just, make friends before you need them. This is a good watchword. Mm-hmm. If and Adrian and I were just talking about this before we started, we are meeting each other for the first time at an event, at an incident, we have failed somewhere along the lines. And that's, if there's any issues with that in local communities, you've got incredible resources with security directors around the country, with SCN, that can help foster some of those connections and do a little bit of that community interface with your community, that we're here to support one another. You waited so patiently, and you waited to go, so there we go.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I struggled to get this out of the stand, but now we're good. Okay, so my name is Elisa Alul. I'm a student at York University in Toronto, Canada. And when it comes to campuses across North America, unfortunately, safety and security has become a major concern for Jewish students. Aside from all of the hate crimes that do happen pretty often, there are also concerns surrounding Israel. And unfortunately, there are many campus security officials who do not take these concerns seriously. And so what I'm wondering is, firstly, is there any kind of collaborative work with police forces in campus security? And secondly, how do you suggest that we address that issue and mitigate these concerns? Thank you.
So that is really a perfect setup for an introduction. I would like to introduce Doron Horowitz. Doron is a member of the SCN team, a fellow Canadian, partially anyhow. Doron runs the Campus Security Initiative for SCN. It is a jointly funded and developed program between Hillel, AEPI, Chabad, the Israel Action Network, and of course the Federation, JFNA. And this is what he does full-time, well, 100% of his time, and then he makes another 100% of his time available to do everything else. So Doron, would you care to share a bit about the work that you're doing? And
So just to let everyone know that we'll be opening up a bar for drinks, because normally following one of these discussions, people get a little bit anxious. There we go. So I think it's, first of all, very, very important for us to acknowledge this whole discussion, and thank you for our distinguished guests, and for law enforcement to be properly represented here. It's a very difficult subject to wrap your head around. And oftentimes, whether it's on a campus or in a community, we respond emotionally. And a lot of our thought process, a lot of our decision-making process is directed and driven by emotions. We all respond when we see images spread across the monitors and the TV. It's very, very difficult for us to fathom. And we have a mechanism inside of us that will just capture it on that 55-inch screen, and then we'll go to bed and we'll try to put it away. The question should not be whether are we safe or not safe. The question should maybe be, what is our responsibility? What is it that we are responsible in doing in order for our lives to be safe? Training and education, empowerment, in terms of the campuses, so that I respond correctly to my fellow Canadian. I also want to acknowledge my former colleagues, Sarah Saber and Judy, who's on her phone for a change. She always is, because she's extremely busy, but I want to welcome you. Canada has a lot of challenges. Sometimes we forget in this great country of ours. So I was down in Irvine. I was down in Charlottesville. I was down in Gainesville recently when Richard Spencer turned out. And I just want to share a few things that I experienced working face-to-face with the students and with law enforcement. What I discovered was, from the student's perspective, there is a fundamental absence of basic security procedures, A. Two is the ownership, the empowerment, that responsibility of, I need to do something in order to contribute to my own safety and security. And that's achieved through partnership and relationships and everything that has been mentioned here. It is critical. We have to begin to own that. So it's the difference between demanding assistance and playing a role. And it's the same with the community. There was actual fear. There was an absence in fundamental procedures like a lockdown, an evacuation. And then also building partnerships with law enforcement, communication, sharing of information, presenting to law enforcement a scenario in which you are seen not as someone that is afraid, but more as someone that is responsible. What is my duty? What is my responsibilities? What is it that you need from me so that we are more safe in this house, in this dormitory? And I'm not just talking about anti-Semitism in Israel. Sexual assaults, parties on Friday nights, a person collapses in a fraternity house. These are more practical issues. So even though we respond emotionally every time an incident occurs, our responsibility has to be driven by pragmatic thinking. In other words, you counter chaos with reason and order. And then you begin to reconcile and find that balance. What is a reasonable level of security? I heard and listened to fear by students. And then I also listened to law enforcement. And listening to law enforcement, there at times appears to be a gap between what they perceive to be a threat and our understanding of our own threat. And that requires further communication, building those relationships, making sure that a police officer or a community officer comes to your campus, comes to your group, understanding how they operate, even tactically, how they would respond, so that if you do develop an emergency procedure, it in fact has to reflect how they would operate, whether it's an active shooter, a sexual assault. We need to ask, what do you need from me when I dial 911? What do you need to hear? The who, what, where, when, and why. And the why sometimes not so more important. There is no answer. Can we completely prevent anything from happening? The honest answer is no. But we do have to own the responsibility of doing everything within our power to be safe and secure, so that we're also a model for other communities. And that is training, education, building partnerships. I don't want to take any more time, but...
Actually, I want you to take one more minute maybe, and could you just communicate the Irvine experience and what happened there?
Sure.
As a concrete example of where there's room for improvement.
Right, so there, about a year and a couple of months ago, there was an incident at the University of California, Irvine, in which in a screening of Beneath the Helmet, everyone recall this? To make a long story short, the Jewish students that were, viewing the film suddenly were somewhat surrounded by, anti-Israel protesters. I'm trying to be, as an Israeli, as politically correct as possible. Thank you for bearing with me. And students, felt intimidated and threatened. And I sat down and listened to each student that experienced that event, of what they were feeling. And students broke down because the fear began to leave. But it was important to listen to them, so that there's no shortage of policies and procedures. The question is, what are they processing? There was going to be a second screening. What needed to occur, and that's when I arrived on the ground, and SCN arrived on the ground, and we started working with law enforcement and the Jewish organizations on campus. The Hillels, the Chabad on campus, the APIs, and the other fraternities, to begin what is it that we can do to prevent a repeat of the events. And only through proper communication, Coordination, implementing proper security procedures. The event went without any incident. The police were properly prepared. They also knew the who, what, where, and when of what we were doing, what our plans were. Never take for granted what is clearly obvious to you is not clearly obvious to others. They had a better understanding of what the threats are. What is the motive? Why are they protesting? What is this film? That's our responsibility to educate. That's a responsibility that we have to now own. We spoke with police, we spoke with the organizations, the event was extremely successful. That is required. It's no more complicated than that.
Thank you.
Okay?
We have a question that's standing, and then we'll get to you, ma'am. Yes?
Hey y'all, my name is Hannah Schwartz. I'm a full-time emergency manager in addition to my Federation responsibilities. So, Dayton, Ohio, sorry. At least in America, anybody who lives in America, every county is required to have an emergency manager, just so y'all know. Feel free to call them and bug them with questions. But to the question for you guys, FEMA offers free online training. Do you all recommend that we encourage people within our communities to take any of the independent study courses or to participate in the ILO, Intelligence Liaison Officer training programs? Or would you all prefer to have us work with our local law enforcement and have them create content for us?
I not shockingly have an opinion about that, but I'll let you gentlemen go, and then I'll...
Yeah, there's a ton of resources that we actually, the funny thing is our first 3 years in operations in LA, we relied heavily on FEMA and DHS to actually host a lot of their training. And actually it's really good training. It's practical. It paints with a broad brush though. Over time we've realized there are some gaps in that training, more so than it needs to be taught through a Jewish lens, because it's very specific. When you start talking about a synagogue and how it operates and how the people walk to and from synagogue and things, that changes the dynamic of vulnerability to the site and other aspects as well. So over time, we found that, yes, there's a ton of resources, infrastructure liaison officer, protective measures course, SPOT training, which is kind of situational awareness. We took a lot of that, and we got feedback from our folks. I found about maybe 30% to 40% applicability. So we took that and we isolated it and created our own training course that we're actually providing to a few other cities for free. We've put the time and resources and research and development into it, and we believe teaching through a Jewish lens is much more, you get your applicability, and everything that's in that course you can use, you can apply. But I think that, yeah, absolutely, the FEMA courses are great place to start if you don't have any resources. DHS, get with your protective security advisor in your city. Those people have all that training laid out. And
No, I would agree on that. You can never bypass local subject matter experts. They're going to respond to the incident right then and there. FEMA is not, until days later, if they're, ever. So you really do have to build that relationship locally, and they're going to have knowledge that just nationally they just can't put in a training curriculum. They're just literally, like you said, broad brushing it. It's so overarching that it doesn't get really to what's more applicable in your community or any other individual micro community. And so you really have to build the relationships locally.
well said.
I share the same opinion. I would just say there's no supplement for practical training and exercise. Right, we could all sit here and read how to do a fire drill, which is going to be an academic exercise, or we could get up and do one, and there's a much different touch feel to that. It's like trying to explain to somebody how to drive a car versus actually getting them in the car. So, and I think good material, but there's a lot of nuance that is individual in particular to each community, and one of the things that we are working through on SCN with partners like Jason and others that will be an initiative moving forward is really looking at that, and I love the way that he puts it, looking at those trainings through the Jewish communal lens. And how do we export those throughout our system? Yes, ma'am.
Okay. My name's Louise Tuckman. I sit on the board of our federation, which is in northern New Jersey, Paramus, New Jersey. And when we came to Paramus a few years ago, several years ago now, we became good friends with our policemen. And this is how we did it. We funded several policemen and several firemen at different times to go to Israel and to talk to their counterparts and to build up a relationship, not just to get information, but to give information. You never know. With the firemen especially, I think they gave as much as they got. But the policemen really got an education. But what we forged were great friendships, because now we have the Israeli policemen coming to us and enjoying a few days, and they have friends, and we feel, not artificially so, but we feel we have another safety net in our community. Our building is very secure. But when you're talking, it sounds like the same type of security that wasn't so great when it had to be, the soft target was still there, the people walking in. So we have the double doors, and you can't get in or out. It reminds me of African safari, where the lions come in the middle, and then you go out. It's very safe, but I found that this was a very easy fix. If you have some funding, and you have a discretionary fund, it's a real good place to put it. And the policeman becomes your friend. Thank you.
Thank you. So 2 years ago, SCN supported and organized the first trip that it had ever done with law enforcement executives and security directors to Israel. And it's always an amazing experience. I've been several times with law enforcement professionals. And one of the things that I would share about the experience, because Jews are not overly represented in law enforcement all the time, but I remember one of the missions I went on, and we were standing on the border, looking across the country at the other border. And Mickey Rosenfeld, who was the spokesman at the time, was talking about Israel and how, as a country, she has to protect herself and what's going on. And one of the deputy chief of the Chicago Police Department, who worked for me at the time at this particular juncture, raised his hand. He said, I'm just confused. You're explaining everything to us as though you're apologizing for the fact that you've got rockets flying into your country, and you're proactively addressing that. That really, you don't need to do that with us as an audience. And it was an amazing moment to see that the bond and the relationship that just started to develop between law enforcement professionals from two very different countries, but they're thinking about it. And I think as a community, that's a worthwhile investment for us to make on both sides of that relationship. Yes?
Okay. I'm Sophia Kenzer from Chicago. I wanted to get your opinion and maybe even possible examples on the optics. How important are the value of the optics, and specifically for preschool? So, I've had kids at 2 different preschools, and as you say, there's always vulnerabilities. You can't, complete construction on 70-year-old buildings in a day. We've had opinions as to just putting a police car outside, or do you take out an ad in the local paper saying, oh, we've just done all these security measures? Is it something like we see at the optics of this conference? I feel very safe. Can you talk about, is there value in that? And have you seen that in your experiences or examples, specifically without creating this hysteria when it comes to little kids?
My belief is you have to have a balance in there. I think, honestly, word of mouth about what measures that you guys have put in place to ensure the safety of the kids. But if you start to be so overt that the kids feel like they're part of this fortress, it becomes like prison walls for them. I mean, they want to also feel like they have some level of freedom too. So there's that balance in there, I think. I work a lot on juvenile justice issues. I work a lot on kids, experiencing trauma in a variety of different ways, acute stress trauma, and I think, honestly, you really have to balance the safety between also letting kids be kids and not feeling like they're in some guarded fortress as well. So I just, I wish I'd have some magic answer to tell you that balance in there. But honestly, I think there's a lot of science in trauma, and I think you have to balance. You have to weigh, one level of safety. Honestly, I think for the parents, you assure them, hey, we've done these things and we've put these measures in place, without giving them, too much information about, maybe the inefficiencies of your security and.
Right, and also to the outside world. So
Yeah,
that's my question
right.
as well. How well does that prevent situation?
Honestly, I think for me, the more people you have in the entrances and everywhere, the more likely you're probably going to have more eyes on the street, more people in those areas where they feel like, okay, I know where I'm walking, I'm going to be noticed, or you're going to save yourself a lot. I mean, and that's not like something that just having parents in those areas, even volunteers, that is going to go a long way than a video camera or, some secret, other security measure in there. Just having volunteers, just being in presence, people will go, that's probably, I'm going to get caught, or I'm going to end up finding myself in a bad situation. So they're not going to end up seeing that as an easy way. We've had a couple potential attacks in Seattle area that were thwarted because they found the measures that, just having people in place, they're like, either way, I'm going to get caught in this situation. And sometimes people want to hit and then they want to get away. And so they find themselves that there's a lot of people that's just not conducive to what they want to do.
We have about 5 minutes and there's 2 questions left. And I'm keenly aware that we're standing between you and your lunch, which is better than after your lunch. I would just add one other thing to the comment. It may be a slight counterpoint to Adrian's. I have 2 girls. One's not so little anymore. She's like 9 going on 35. They both go to a Jewish day school in Chicago. It's the same school that I went to. And there is armed security 24/7 at the school. Some of those officers have been there since I was at the school. They are as much a part of us and as a community as anyone else. And the kids are resilient. They view those people as part of their community. So I think we just have to be cognizant that if it's presented in the right way, it becomes a very normal course of operations. Yes, sir. And then one more question, we'll wrap up.
Thank you. My name is Matt Paretsky. I'm from Long Beach, California. We spoke briefly about active shooters, and there is a lot of discussion in the media these days about an armed citizenry and concealed carry holders. Is there a place for armed members of a congregation outside of security, or do they just add to chaos and potential risk in the case of an emergent event?
We get this question a lot in the community. I think it's a really great question. First of all, the Second Amendment is a real thing. So you have a right to carry if you've met all the requirements to do so. But as a cop, let me just say this. When we used to do concerts or we used to work in confined spaces, we had to make sure we deconflicted. We all had to train the same way. We knew who each other were. And during an emergency, we knew that the issues of crossfire, the issues of blue-on-blue violence, things like that. So I would just suggest this. When you're working in confined spaces with large groups of people, I don't know if an uncoordinated introduction of weapons is a great idea tactically. If you coordinate those things, you work together, you train together, and you have protocols in place, one of them being when law enforcement gets there, get on the ground. If you're up with a weapon and you're not a cop, I see you as a threat. So our security folks know that. They're highly trained to do that. I just worry that if the citizenry starts carrying in a way that is not trained, you're going to have blue-on-blue violence, or you're going to have inadvertent shootings, things like that. So we just have to be really careful how we employ those weapons.
And I would agree. I work with all the schools in our Seattle School District. People ask this question all the time. I would say the same thing is that we have 1,400 officers, and there's probably at least, when a shooting happens at a school, you're going to have 100 officers go into the same location that they don't even know. They're coming from all over the city to literally go to that one school to figure out how to stop the threat. And they might not know the teachers or the people or the personnel. They're not going to, and they're going in there to stop the threat. And if the threat, it does to them, they're not going to say, oh, I've got a teacher on the back of my shirt and that says that I'm safe. They're not worried about that. They are strictly focused on what appears to be a threat. And if somebody's holding a gun, it puts you in a bad situation. So I'm kind of in this area where I think if you're trained, but when you're working in a major city, it doesn't matter all the training in the world, because you don't know how many people are responding to that scene, and they're not going to be specifically in that from that area.
Very quick, sir. Last question, and we'll be...
Very quick.
Great, perfect.
in a building, along, they don't. No more of this about did not. What's going on? Fight. It was to make law to prohibit mentally individuals like AK. Try to buy an automobile without a driver. It's impossible. What if you had those types of those and say, I don't want this AK-47.
So the question is about legislation. I think I'll just wrap up very quickly by saying this. Legislation was proposed in Congress to not allow individuals with mental health issues to purchase firearms. The legislation stalled and it was defeated at several different points, and that's where we're at. So we have to deal with that reality as a community and as professionals with training and planning, and that's the reality of the world that we live in. So thank you all very much. I'd like to thank my fellow panelists.
Good work, bro. No.
Thanks.
Thank you. Very pleasurable.
Thank you,
It was
Susie.
very pleasurable.
Yes, of course.